12 noon, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, this is an historic weekend in Washington, and those who are visiting the Capitol and following the proceedings, I think, understand the gravity of the decisions that lie before us. On August the 2nd, our debt ceiling expires. That has never happened in our history. One time there was a technical period of a day or two, but there's never been a long period of time when the United States of America basically defaulted on its debt. And it's a very serious matter. It's one that affects our nation, our debt, and literally every family and business that live within our boundaries. And here's the reason why it's so important. In 1939, we created this law which said that a president can come to Congress periodically and ask for the authority to borrow money to pay for the things that Congress has already appropriated. So, when members of the House and Senate say to the President of the United States, as an example, we want you to continue to wage war in Afghanistan at the cost of $10 billion a month, this President knows that he will have to borrow about $4 billion a month to meet that congressional appropriation. You see, we borrow about 40 cents for every dollar we spend. Similarly, when it comes to the payments that we make to our veterans who are disabled, we have promised them we will pay you because you served our country and you lost a limb or you were injured, and we will compensate you for that loss for the rest of your life. We understand in making that commitment that we're also making a commitment to borrow the money necessary to do it. So periodically, a president will come to Congress and say, I understand our obligations, which you have sent to me and I have approved, and now I ask you to extend my authority to borrow the money to meet those obligations. That has happened 89 times since 1939. Since we passed this law, presidents of both parties have come to Congress and asked for that authority. And as I mentioned, not one time did Congress say no beyond that one technical period in, I believe, 1979. 89 times, 55 times by Republican presidents and 34 times by Democratic presidents. When you look at the presidents who have requested extensions of the debt ceiling that I've just described, the president that holds the record for the most requests is President Ronald Reagan, who in an 8-year period of time asked to have the debt ceiling of the United States extended 18 times, more than twice a year. During his presidency, the debt of the United States during the Ronald Reagan presidency tripled, and that's why he came to Congress so often. The president who ranks second in terms of increasing our national debt during his 8 years is President George W. Bush. The debt of America virtually doubled during his presidency because we waged 2 wars that we didn't pay for. We did something we had never done in our history, cut taxes, particularly for the rich in the midst of a war, and had many programs unpaid for. And so president after president have used this statutory authority to come to Congress and ask for approval to extend the debt ceiling. President Obama has done the same. And as of August 2nd, his authority to ask to borrow money will expire. Now, that is a serious moment if we default on the debt. It'll be the first time it has happened in our history. What will it mean to the United States of America to default on our debt and fail to extend the debt ceiling? Well, imagine if you decided as a homeowner to stop making your mortgage payments. Within a period of time, you'd receive a phone call from your creditor saying, did you forget your check this month? And if you say, no, I'm just not going to pay it, you understand the consequences. your credit status is going to be affected. The United States credit status is the best in the world. We have a AAA bond rating, the highest of any nation. And because we have that high bond rating, we have the lowest interest rates that we pay to borrow money. Well, go back to the homeowner. If you've just defaulted on your mortgage, your credit report is going to look pretty bad. The likelihood that you can turn around and borrow money the next month is in doubt. And if someone will loan you money at that point, it will be at a higher interest rate because you're a risk now. You failed to make your mortgage payment. Similarly, if the United States fails to extend the debt ceiling, our credit rating will go down from AAA. The interest rate charged the United States government will increase, and what has been considered the rock-solid best economy in the world will be jeopardized by this action. What does it mean for the interest rate on the United States debt to go up? This calculation has been made by many, and I believe it's accurate. For every 1% increase in the interest rate the United States pays on its debt, we will add $130 billion a year to our debt, $1.3 trillion, roughly, over a 10-year period of time. So the failure to extend the debt ceiling, the default of the United States, and higher interest rates will make our debt worse. That's why what we're facing this week in Washington is so terrible. Because what we're dealing with here is a politically manufactured crisis. We are dealing with a self-inflicted wound. Because the House Republicans under Speaker Boehner refused to extend the President's request for the debt ceiling, when our current authority expires August 2nd, we could find ourselves paying higher interest rates, even deeper in debt, and it gets worse. Because when the interest rates paid by the United States government go up, interest rates across our economy go up. What it means is that a lot of innocent people who are borrowing money to buy a car or a home or to pay for college loans or to pay off their credit card are going to pay more. It is like imposing a tax on every family and business in America at the worst possible time. We are recovering from a recession. Too many people out of work. Businesses need to expand and borrow money. Raising interest rates stops that. This doesn't have to happen. This self-inflicted wound by the House Republicans and Speaker Boehner does not have to happen. Now, in fairness to Speaker Boehner, his goal is to reduce America's debt. I accept that challenge. In fact, for the last year and a half, I have engaged personally on a bipartisan basis to meet that challenge. First, as a member of President Obama's Deficit Commission, the Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission, we sat for months and listened to testimony, and finally 11 out of 18 of us voted for the report that was issued. What it came up with was a 10-year plan to reduce our debt by $4 trillion. Not easy. It sounds like it would be easy when you look at all the money we spend, but when you get into the specifics, it's politically painful. But what we agreed to do was to put everything on the table. And I want to tell you, I did that with some reservation. I am concerned about many things in our country, but two things in particular. I'm concerned about the most vulnerable people in America, those who are aged, poor, and sick. And I want to make certain that at the end of the day, America still has a safety net, that this good and caring nation is doing everything it can to help these people. What programs do they rely on? Well, they rely on the Earned Income Tax Credit under our tax code, the Child Care Tax Credit, Medicaid, the health insurance that covers a third of the children in America, and many elderly people in nursing homes. So when we talk about cuts in these programs, I was very sensitive to them and determined to make sure that we didn't cut any more than necessary to reach our goal. We also put on the table revenue. We have to do that. How can we ask working families in America to pay more on their children's college student loans and be prepared to sacrifice? How can we ask seniors in America to be willing to sacrifice when it comes to their Medicare program and not turn to the wealthiest people in our country and ask them to join in this sacrifice? That has become the major stumbling block in this negotiation. You see, Republican Speaker Boehner has said, I will not accept any, underline the word any, tax increase on the wealthiest people in America. I will agree, he said, to cut everything else, every other benefit for every other person, but not one penny more in taxes from the wealthiest person in America. That doesn't strike me as fair or just or reasonable, but that's where we are. We also put on this program spending cuts, substantial spending cuts, so that every single program in America would be closely inspected, reduced in spending, and move us toward a deficit reduction goal. And then I want to step further. I joined with 5 of my colleagues, 3 Republicans and 3 of us on the Democratic side, and we sat down for 6 months and worked on something called the Gang of Six and came up with a specific plan of how to do this. Well, Mr. President, you know we had a meeting a couple weeks ago, and we invited most of the members of the Senate to come and listen to what we had proposed. 49 senators showed up, Democrats and Republicans, in a room not far from here, and listened as we laid out what we considered a bipartisan plan to deal with the deficit. We then went back to those senators and said, how many of you will put your name on the line to join us in a bipartisan effort to reduce the deficit? And we're now up to 36 senators who've done that. Over a third of the senators have signed on to a bipartisan effort to reduce the deficit. What a sharp contrast that is from what's going on in the House of Representatives, where right now the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker, is negotiating only with Republican members to pass a plan. Mr. President, I don't think that's what the American people sent us to do. I don't think they said to Democrats, come to Washington but don't speak to Republicans, or to Republicans, come to Washington and don't speak to Democrats. The bottom line is, Democrats and Republicans notwithstanding, we are all Americans, and we all have a responsibility. So here we are today at this impasse. And Speaker Boehner announced Monday night, when he had a press conference at the same time as the President, with an announcement to the nation, that he had a plan, he called it a bipartisan plan, that he would pass in the House of Representatives. We expected that to happen Tuesday, and it didn't. And then Wednesday, and it didn't. And then yesterday, and he failed to pass it then too. We waited all night until 11 o'clock when we finally adjourned for the Speaker to pass what he considered to be a good plan and for us to react to it. Now we hear the Speaker may be able to get to it later in the afternoon, in the early evening hours. Mr. President, this is unacceptable.
Senator has used 10 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent for 5 additional minutes.
Okay.
Is that right?
Without objection.
Second? All right. All right. Mr. President, that is unacceptable. By my calculation, we have 4 days left before we default on our debt. 4 days left before the American economy suffers this mortal blow. 4 days left before we default on America's full faith and credit for the first time in our history. 4 days left while businesses across America are withholding agreements and negotiations that create jobs. 4 days left where the American people have to worry that if we default on our debt, that the government will have to pick and choose those who will receive government checks in August. A senator from Pennsylvania came to the floor for the last 2 days and said, oh, if we default on the debt, we can manage that. Really? If we default on the debt, we'll have $172 billion to spend and $306 billion in obligations. He said, well, of course we have to pay interest on the other debts. We don't want to default on everything. Okay. And he said, of course we have to pay everybody under Social Security. Yes. And he said, of course we have to pay our soldiers who are in combat. Agreed. All good ideas. And he said, and then we'll work the others out. Who did he leave off the list? He left off the list every federal employee. That would be all of the people working at the Central Intelligence Agency monitoring terrorist to stop them from attacking the United States. That would be the air traffic controllers in our airline system across America. That would be the federal prison guards working in federal correctional facilities. That would be all of our veterans receiving disability checks. Easily managed, not so fast. It wouldn't be easily managed. There would be losers in that process, and many of them are innocent people who would be lost to the frustration of this political process. Mr. President, there is a way through this, but the only way through it is if members of both parties come together and do it quickly. I don't think it's going to happen in the House. The House has decided they're going to do an all-Republican, all-day approach. That isn't going to solve the problem in the House or the problem on Capitol Hill. This morning, the Majority Leader, Harry Reid, standing at this desk, turned to Senator McConnell from Kentucky, the Republican leader, and said, now it's our turn. Now we have to step up. Now we have to come up with a bipartisan approach and show leadership. Senator Reid is right. Senator McConnell has demonstrated in the past that he's been willing to do that, and now more than ever he should. I think that the 36 senators who've stepped up, joined me and others in saying that we can find a bipartisan way to deal with this must be heard. Our voices must be heard, but more importantly, the spirit of compromise must be heard. That is what the American people expect of us. They didn't send us here, each of us, to win every battle under our own terms and not give. They sent us here to govern and to respect this great country. I would sincerely hope that we will approach the next 72 hours with a spirit of humility. Humility to understand that so many innocent people across America, families and businesses, are waiting on us and counting on us. We cannot fail them. No one will care at the end of the day who has the great political headline, but we will all be judged, Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, as to whether we met our constitutional obligation to this nation and the people who live here. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, the challenges we face are difficult. I am proud of the work that the House of Representatives has done. I don't appreciate it being suggested that somehow they're unreasonable, because I don't believe that's fair to say about them. They worked very hard. They complied with the congressionally mandated statutory requirement to pass a budget. They passed a 10-year budget that was honest, open. It was publicly debated in the House of Representatives. They passed it, and it would have fundamentally altered the debt trajectory of America. It would put us on a sound path. It could have gone a little further, frankly, but it goes further than anything else we've seen and put us on the path to a sound and economic future. And what happened in the Senate? I'm ranking Republican on the Senate Budget Committee. The majority leader, the leadership of the Democratic Party in the Senate, on the eve of us beginning to mark up a budget in the Senate, as we're required to do by law. It doesn't say you go to jail if you don't follow the law. It doesn't have any penalty, I'll acknowledge. So it's a law, but we don't have to follow it, except we certainly have an obligation to do so. Certainly we would want, I think, to have a budget in the Senate, and we haven't had one now for over 800 days, over 2 years. And so we were within a week, less than that, of commencing hearings to mark up a budget that would be moved by the Democratic majority, and when they do so, they don't have to it's not subject to a filibuster. It can be passed with 50 votes, 53 Democrats in the Senate, and the majority party always has that obligation to move a budget. Senator Reid, the Democratic leadership, decided that they wouldn't do it. He said it would be foolish to have a budget, so we haven't passed a budget. And the House budget, as said, would reduce spending by up to $6 trillion, $5 or $6 trillion. And because of the Senate's objection and the President's objection, they've agreed to raise the debt limit by $1 trillion, and they've agreed to just cut spending in America by $1 trillion, trying to reach an agreement so we wouldn't have a shutdown. And then all of a sudden, my Democratic colleagues now come forward and say they don't want to accept that they want the Reid Amendment. And the Reid Amendment has the same actual savings, and we've looked at the numbers, and we've seen how they've done it, and it's about $1 trillion savings in the Reid bill, reduction in spending, about $1 trillion. But he claims it's $2.7 trillion, almost 3 times what it actually achieves, and therefore they want to continue raise the debt limit, the second largest amount it's ever been raised, almost $3 trillion. Why? Because the President said, really, this is what the President said a week ago. The only bottom line that I have is that we extend this debt ceiling through the next election until 2013, close quote. The President thinks this is about him. It's all about him. This is about America, what's good for this country. It's not about the President. It's not about politics. If it was about politics, I wouldn't vote for the Boehner Amendment, and neither would a lot of those patriotic members of the House, because it's not enough. It does not do what we need to do. We need to do $4, $5, $6 trillion over 10 years. The debt is going to increase over the next 10 years from $9 to $13 trillion. $1 trillion is not enough. It can only be seen as a step in the right direction. So forgive me if I'm a little frustrated about that. Now, I want to talk about something that's problematic and we need to know about. It's not being focused on. And this is Senator Reid's amendment. His solution to the deficit problem, raising the debt ceiling so we can keep borrowing money and spending more than we take in, and we are borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend. The President this morning said he liked the Reid Amendment. That's what he'd like to see. He doesn't like the House version. But I think there's some things we all ought to think about and know that's in the Reid Amendment. As I said, we've gone 821 days without a budget. The law requires us to have a budget. A lack of a congressional budget contributes to our fiscal nightmare. Since we've not had a budget, we've spent $7 trillion. And the reason we don't have a budget is because it's carefully, deliberately orchestrated that we not have one by the leadership of this Senate. And they have planned for just the eventuality that's occurring, and I have warned about it for weeks and months on the floor of the Senate, that we would be at the 11th hour with people scurrying around in secret, plotting deals to try to figure out how to deal with the crisis this nation faces. That's exactly what's happened. Today it was announced that the second quarter economic growth was just 1.3%, anemic, well below what we were hoping to see and thought we might. And we've had expert testimony that the debt we have pulls down economic growth. Had the Senate adopted a budget in a timely manner this year, as the House did, we would not be at this last-minute crisis. But it was deliberately orchestrated because it gives maximum leverage to the President and press people. And the question not is what's in the deal, but do you have a deal? Just do anything. We are going to be in a crisis if you don't pass something. We just want a deal. So the House has, come up with very, very reasonable compromise. But it looks like some people just want to have this fuss and put us through the crisis, even when they get basically what they've asked for. Now, the Reid Amendment to increase the debt limit deems 2 consecutive budget resolutions for fiscal years 2012 and 2013. In other words, it basically takes over the budget process and sets the basic spending numbers. Does the President think the Senate should go 2 more years without crafting or passing a budget? We've already gone 2. The Reid Amendment sets spending allocations for most Senate committees at the congressional budget offices' rising baseline. These are bureaucratic members. They work hard, but they're not elected. They're not constitutionally accountable. So it just says we're going to deem the amount we spend what CBO has projected our growth in spending to be. And CBO projects growth in spending. They don't set that as right for America, but they project that's what will occur under current circumstances, and this just deems those higher growing numbers as what should be. So without hearings or debate on these allocations, this provision would provide a further excuse for avoiding a budget and increase the likelihood that the Congressional Budget Act will be violated for the 3rd straight year. This is an abrogation of the responsibilities of the Senate and of the Budget Committee of the United States Senate. We were not elected to the Senate and chosen to serve on the Committee on the Budget as the presiding officer as a member of that committee. We weren't chosen to sit on the Budget Committee to see most of the budget levels automatically raised based on a set of spending growth projections by some apparatchiks in the CBO. They're not empowered to do that. They don't claim to, actually. I shouldn't demean them. They just do what their duty is. So it is this kind of process that's placed the country in a financial crisis. We keep locking in spending levels that are going up. And when we reduce a little bit the growth in spending, you know what we say we're doing? We're cutting spending, and it's spending more. That's the way the budget is. When they say we're going to save $1 trillion through the House plan.
The Senator's time has expired.
I thank the Chair. I would ask for 2 additional minutes to wrap up.
Is there objection? Without objection.
So the provision that takes over that and sets us on an automatic growth course is not the right one. And I would just note that when we say we save $1 trillion over the next 10 years by the bill that Senator Reid has, and it does about $1 trillion, and so does the House bill, it does about $1 trillion. The difference is how long or how much a raising of the debt ceiling is achieved by that. Senator Reid wants almost 3 years, 2 years, and the House members would do it based on a dollar-per-dollar matter. But that $1 trillion does not reduce spending. It only reduces the growth in spending, and that's one of the reasons we're able to hide Congress is the amount of money it's really spending every year, and that's one reason debt is so high. So the Budget Committee should be allowed to fulfill its duties. The Budget Committee should be allowed to mark up in fiscal year 2012. It'll begin October 1st of this year. We need a budget now. We're past due. Once a budget is adopted by the committee, it should be taken to the full Senate, allowed to be amended as the law provides. And I'm disappointed that the President doesn't seem to agree with that. He seems to have bought into the idea that the regular processes of the Senate shouldn't be followed. He agrees with Senator Reid, apparently, that if they can just keep it all bottled up to an end and we come up on a crisis, that they can all maneuver in secret and cut a deal, and that's the way we serve the American people. So, Mr. President, I thank the Chair. I feel real strongly that we are undermining the great power and responsibility of the Senate to be that place where the great issues are discussed publicly and openly, that we are accountable, that we cast votes. And let me just say again, the reason the Majority Leader did not want a budget to come up is because when you bring a budget up, you have to vote. People have alternatives. They offer amendments, and the members go on record, and he's protecting his members from having to do the primary responsibility of a United States Senator, and that is before the world to cast their vote, to be responsible for it, and to be accountable to the people who sent them there. And it's not good for this body. This body should have been engaged in a historic debate about the threat the debt poses to our future, and we have been unengaged. The discussions are being taken in secret without the American people being able to hold their representatives accountable. I object. Thank the Chair, and we yield the floor.
The Senator from Missouri.
I try to listen very carefully to folks at home, and I would not quarrel with my friend from Alabama in saying that it's very clear to me, it's been clear to me for a long time, that Missourians were very, very worried about spending in the federal government. In fact, my friend from Alabama and I started working on this before, if you can say that we were trying to cut spending before cutting spending was cool. He and I were working this floor for votes to try to do something about spending long before last November's election. Yes?
I thank the Senator for recalling that event, and I know you've continued with another proposal, working with across the aisle to have a proposal that has potential to be more effective than even the one that we worked on last year together. So I thank the Senator for being willing to work in a way that could be effective to do better.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. President. And I thank my friend from Alabama. There is nothing wrong with walking across the aisle and finding common ground. And frankly, it's kind of what I thought would be common when I came to the United States Senate. That's kind of what I'd learned in the history books, that would be common. I've been watching what's been developing, knowing that my folks at home want us to cut spending. I certainly have been part of that and wanting to cut spending. And I've watched this debt ceiling approach, and it's like watching a movie and watching a car driving along, and you're like in a camera above it, and you see what's ahead, and you see this cliff. And you see this car driving towards this cliff. And you're thinking, you start tensing, you think, oh, surely they're not going to go over the cliff. Well, they have an opportunity to avoid going over the cliff. They're not going to go over the cliff. We're not going to see these people die. They're not going to drive right over that cliff. They're not going to knowingly drive over a cliff. And I've been thinking for the last several weeks, well, there's no way that people that are elected because they love their country are going to let the car go over the cliff. And I've got to tell you, I'm worried. Now, what do we have to do to keep them going over the cliff? Make no mistake about it, it's a cliff. It is a historic moment for our country. Never before in the history of our country have the world markets been worried about whether the United States of America will pay its bills. Never has that happened before in our history. So what does it take? Well, it's not complicated what it takes. It takes one basic thing, compromise. To keep from going over the cliff, all we have to do is compromise. And I will tell you, reading my mail and listening to phone calls that have come in on the answering machine, and I'm going to take phone calls myself over the weekend, you know what Missourians are now saying? Please don't go over the cliff. Please compromise. I'm confident that's what most Missourians want. And compromises have already occurred, big compromises. Most of us on this side of the aisle really believe that the way we get at our long-term debt structure is a responsible approach that includes some revenues. Now, I advocate cleaning out the goodies in the tax code so we can lower tax rates. I really don't understand how you can at the same time vote to gut the Medicare program and vote to continue writing checks to big oil. I cannot conceive how you vote that way. I cannot imagine that I would vote to keep writing a taxpayer check to the most wealthy and profitable corporations in the history of the world at the same time I was voting to put Medicare on a voucher program. Saying to seniors, you know, if you're 83 and you've got 3 chronic illnesses and you run out of Medicare coverage, you're on your own. I can't imagine doing that. But we compromised. We compromised and said, okay, we'll set revenues aside for now. You won't vote for revenues, Republican Party. Members of the House in the Republican Party, you will not vote for revenues. We took revenues off the table. And by the way, some people in our party were not happy with that. I got those phone calls. Why did you take revenues off? Why did you capitulate? Why did you give in? We gave in because we care about our country and we don't want to go over the cliff. That's why we gave in. So we gave in on revenues. The Republicans wanted us to cut spending by more than we raised the debt ceiling. It's a political thing we need to do, not required by the economics, but we've done that. So now we've put revenues aside, compromise. We have said we're going to cut spending by more than the rise in the debt ceiling. Now, the only thing we've not compromised on, the only thing, which I think is really, when you think about it, I didn't think, frankly, this may have been a big a deal until I stand here today. That is to do this again in 6 months, to leave this loaded gun on the table. We're going to leave this loaded gun on the table for our economy. You talk to small businesses right now, and they are scared about what's going to happen next week. Will they be able to borrow money? Will people be able to afford to borrow money to buy cars? Will they be able to afford to borrow money to buy homes? You talk about the economy going in a tailspin, and we want to keep that loaded gun on the table for another 6 months? There's no way we can provide the certainty in this kind of economic climate if we leave the loaded gun on the table. So the only thing that we've not agreed to that's in the Boehner plan, well, it depends on which plan it is. They keep changing it to try to get enough votes, but I don't know what it is today. But the only thing that we really are not going to budge on is saying to this country and our business community and our job creators, we're going to kill job creation for sure for the next 6 months by telling you we want to repeat this ridiculous exercise in 6 months. We're not going to do that. And the irony is the people who want us to do that are the people who have been preaching certainty. We've got to have certainty. By the way, let's do this again in 6 months. We've got to have certainty. It's really important we do this again in 6 months. Now, I know that the leader is working on trying to get a compromise today, and I'm confident that before the day is over, there'll be some kind of compromise that will be before this body that we'll have a chance to vote on. And I will tell you this. You will never hear me brag about refusing to compromise. Some of my colleagues from Missouri that serve in the House of Representatives are willing right now to brag about refusing to compromise. They're willing to say it's a good thing to go off the cliff. I will never brag about refusing to compromise because I don't think that's what we do here. You look back in history, and America's brightest moments usually happened around the table of compromise. Those most difficult questions that this country has wrestled with through the years, we have forged a way forward through compromise. And that's what we need today. That's what we need tomorrow. That's what we need as we approach the edge of a cliff. So my last message I leave my colleagues across the aisle, we have shown our willingness to compromise. Please show us yours. Please show us yours. And allow us to vote. Allow us to vote on the compromise. If you don't want to vote for the compromise, then don't vote for it. But allow us a chance to vote for it. Is that too much to ask? Just to allow us an opportunity to move to a vote, to avoid this country having a diminished status permanently in the world. I don't think that's too much to ask. So let us vote. And if you can't compromise on the substance of the compromises that will be put forward, at least allow our voices to be heard by allowing a vote. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Quorum call be equally divided and then suggest that.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be equally divided and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Without objection, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that morning business be extended until 3:30 this afternoon, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, and at 3:30 the majority leader be recognized.
Without objection.
Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
From South Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to remind my colleagues that this work period was supposed to be our opportunity to finally enact, after years of delay, the free trade agreements with our allies South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. These agreements were signed over 4 years ago, and this administration has had more than 2.5 years to submit them to Congress for consideration, but they have failed to do so. Unfortunately, we are going to have to continue to wait at least until September before we get a vote. Why does it matter that we pass these agreements? It matters for 2 reasons, Mr. President. First, because expanding trade opportunities creates American jobs. Second, Because we live in a competitive global economy, and other nations are not standing still while we delay. Economists overwhelmingly agree that expanding trade opportunities creates jobs. The Obama White House, for example, estimates that enactment of these 3 trade agreements will boost exports by at least $12 billion, supporting over 70,000 American jobs. The fact that lowering barriers to U.S. exports will create jobs for American workers is just common sense. Consider that our market is already largely open to foreign imports, including those from Korea, Colombia, and Panama. Without trade agreements to ensure similar treatment for our exporters, American businesses will continue to face high tariff and non-tariff barriers abroad. Consider just one example. The market for agricultural products in Korea, which is the world's 13th largest economy. Korea's tariffs on imported agricultural goods average 54%, compared to an average 9% tariff on these imports into the United States. 54% added on for us to get our agricultural products into Korea, only 9% for them to get those same products into the United States. That is a 45% differential, Mr. President. Passage of the Korea Free Trade Agreement will level this playing field. Yet this administration continues to delay sending the agreements to Congress. The Obama White House would prefer to hold these agreements hostage because of a desire to expand the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program rather than improve the competitive position of American producers. At a time of near-record unemployment and slow economic growth, this delay is unacceptable. And I want to just put a fine point on that, Mr. President, by just this morning the numbers came out. The Bureau of Economic Analysis released its advance estimate of growth in the inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, GDP, for the second quarter. And according to the advance estimate, annualized GDP growth in the second quarter was just 1.3%. Now, if you look at, they went back and revised the first quarter of 2011. They revised it downward to 0.4%, down from a reported rate of 1.9%. So they've adjusted downward the first quarter growth rate from 1.9% down to 0.4%, and we now know, according to the advance estimate at least, that second quarter GDP growth is only 1.3%. Way under what the assumptions have been, way under what the estimates have been, and way under what it's going to take for us to get the economy turned around and growing again and get people back to work. And you couple that with the job-crushing regulations, the taxes that have come since this administration has taken office, Mr. President, is making it very, very difficult for our economy to recover and to grow and to get back on track. And so the administration would like to hold these agreements hostage because of their desire to expand the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program rather than get these producers back access to these markets that we should have access to in some of these countries. And we just can't afford to wait any longer to do that. The reasons are very clear. We've got an economy that is sluggish, that is struggling to get back on its feet. We have 3 free trade agreements that have been hanging around here, languishing literally now for 4 years, that would open up export opportunities and, as I said, even according to the President's own estimates, add 70,000 jobs to our economy. Well, the position of Leader McConnell and Republican senators has been consistent from the beginning. We are happy to have a debate on the merits of expanding trade adjustment assistance and to consider this bill as a standalone measure. But we will not hold the trade agreements hostage to consideration of trade adjustment assistance. I want to commend my colleagues, Senators Portman and Blunt, for the letter that they recently spearheaded with 10 other Republican senators committing to support the necessary procedural votes to consider trade adjustment assistance as a standalone measure and on its own merits. In light of this letter, it's very clear that the administration has run out of excuses for not submitting the trade agreements to Congress. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, to be able to enter the Portman-Blunt letter into the record. There is a path forward in both the House and the Senate for trade adjustment assistance, and we have bipartisan majorities in both chambers waiting to vote for the Korea, Colombia, and Panama agreements. So why are we still waiting for the White House to do the right thing and send us these agreements? This ongoing delay is having a real impact on American businesses, and it will only get worse. On July 1st, the European Union-Korea trade agreement went into effect. According to press reports, European exports to Korea rose 16% in the first 13 days after the Korea-EU free trade agreement entered into force. Now, let's be clear, Mr. President, about what this means. Korean consumers are choosing to buy German, French, and British cars, electronics, and agricultural products rather than American-made products because these European products now have a price advantage. This was entirely preventable if we had acted on the U.S.-Korea agreement sooner. Likewise, the Canada-Colombia agreement will go into effect on August the 15th. This will result in an advantage for Canadian goods such as construction equipment, aircraft, and a range of other industrial and agricultural products. Much as with Korea, United States businesses will find themselves at a competitive disadvantage because we have failed to act. Again, this did not have to happen. The administration finalized its labor action plan for Colombia back in April. We've had plenty of time to consider these agreements over the past several months. Instead, we are facing a situation where United States wheat producers are likely to be completely shut out of the Colombian market once the agreement with Canada has gone into effect. This is amazing if you think about it. When you consider that just a few years ago, American wheat producers dominated the market in Colombia with a 73% market share. That was as of 2008. In 2010, for the first time in the history of the United States-Colombia trade, the U.S. lost to Argentina its position as Colombia's #1 agricultural supplier. Now consider the story of the three crops that we grow, well, among the three crops that we grow in South Dakota, soybeans, corn, and wheat. The combined market share in Colombia for these three U.S. agricultural exports has decreased from 81% in 2008 to 19% as of 2010, a decline of 62 percentage points in a two-year period. 81% to 19% market share in corn, wheat, and soybeans for American agricultural producers. You think about that. That is a staggering collapse, Mr. President, which was totally avoidable, totally preventable if we had simply acted on these trade agreements much sooner. This is the real cost of our delay, while our trading partners continue to pursue new regional and bilateral trade agreements. We're living in a global economy where America cannot afford to stand still on trade. As Senator Baucus noted at a recent Finance Committee hearing, in 1960, exports accounted for only 3.6% of our entire U.S. GDP. Today, exports account for 12.5% of our GDP. Exports of U.S. goods and services support over 10 million American jobs. It is long past time that we get back in the game by passing the three pending trade agreements. America's manufacturers, America's farmers, America's service providers cannot afford to wait any longer. And so I call upon the administration, Mr. President, to submit the trade agreements to Congress before the August recess. We're not going to be able to consider these agreements until September, but sending them to Congress now will send a strong signal that this administration is finally serious about getting them done. It would also be good and be an important show of good faith to our close allies, South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. Mr. President, these job-creating, market-opening trade agreements should be at the top of the agenda when we get back in September. And again, I want to reemphasize the importance of that in light of these economic numbers, the data that's coming out that points out that in the second quarter of this year, our economic growth was a sluggish 1.3%, and that the revised estimate now for the first quarter of this year was 0.4%. We will never get the unemployment rate down. We will never get America's economy expanding and back on its feet. We will never start dealing with these massive debt issues that we have, one, if we don't cut spending, which is the other, but also if we're not growing and expanding the American economy. We can do that. There are so many things that these trade agreements would do, not only for agricultural exporters, but for other producers of American goods, and we ought to be doing that, Mr. President. it is high time that we at least did some of the things that we can do to get the economy growing again. And I can't emphasize enough the lost market opportunities, the lost chance at economic growth, the lost jobs that are associated with the fact that this administration has delayed now, since they've been in office, 2.5 years, in submitting these 3 free trade agreements to Congress, 3 free trade agreements that have broad bipartisan support for Congress, which we as Republicans have been waiting to act upon now for almost the 4 years since these agreements were negotiated in the first place. And so it's high time that we change that. It's one thing that we can do to affect the economy in this country, among the other things. And I would simply add as sort of a final point that the debate that we're having about the debt limit is also one that needs to be dealt with if we're going to get serious about growing the economy and creating jobs. Because if you look at the economy today, you look at this president's economic record, and you look at the data, almost every metric that you can measure, he has made this economy much worse. And the president has said repeatedly, and he said it in his speech the other night, blames the previous administration for where we are today. And I don't think anybody here would dispute the fact that he inherited a difficult set of economic circumstances. But there is no question, if you look at every metric, that he has made the situation much worse. Whether that's unemployment, which is up 18%, there are 2.1 million more people unemployed today than there were when he took office. Whether it's the debt, which has grown by 35% since he took office. Whether it's the number of Americans who are receiving food stamps, which has gone up by 40% since he took office. And I might add, in my state of South Dakota, by 58% increase in the number of people receiving food stamps. The cost of health care in this country is up 19% since this president took office. The cost of gasoline has gone up almost 100%, 99% since this president took office. The amount of the debt per person in this country has gone up by $11,000. Every American now owes $11,000 more as a share of their share of our federal debt since this president took office. The economic record of this administration is abysmal. And it is high time that we took the steps to do something about that. And it strikes me, at least, as I look at the policies that they've been putting in place, that they seem to want to make it more difficult and more expensive for people in this country to create jobs. You see that in regulations coming out of all these various agencies. You see it in the massive run-up in growth in the size of government, the new mandates that have been imposed on a lot of our small businesses as a result of the new health care bill, the new taxes that have been imposed on our small businesses as a result of the new health care legislation. At every turn, American small businesses who create the jobs that will get this economy growing again tell us that the economic uncertainty, the job-crushing policies that are coming out of this administration have been a major, major inhibitor, a major impediment to them creating jobs and getting people back to work in this country. And the trade agreements is just something I would add on to that list. We've got 3 trade agreements that have been teed up now for almost 4 years since they were negotiated. This administration has been in office now for 2.5 years. The president continually gets up, as he does at the State of the Union, and talks about wanting to double trade in 5 years, talks about supporting these 3 trade agreements, and yet it's a very simple thing. All he has to do is to submit them to Congress. The trade agreements are negotiated. All he has to do is to send them up here, and we are ready to act to put Americans back to work, to open up export opportunities to American producers, to get the economy growing again and creating jobs. And so, Mr. President, I hope that in addition to dealing with the issue of runaway spending and debt, which in my view is the predominant issue that we need to deal with, and clearly between now and Tuesday, we've got to get a solution in place that will avert the economic adversity that we could be dealing with, adverse circumstances, if we don't deal with that. But that needs to be accompanied by serious reductions in spending reforms, and then we've got to be putting in place policies that will enable economic growth in this country, that will make it less expensive, less difficult for small businesses to create jobs, not more difficult. And unfortunately, that is the record to date of this administration. I hope we can change that and start today by sending these trade agreements up to the Congress so that we can act on them and get these things approved and get American businesses exporting to these 3 countries. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
without